In the harsh winter of 1206, when Temüjin was proclaimed Genghis Khan by the Mongolian tribes at the Onon River kurultai, few could have predicted that his most potent weapon would not be the composite bow or the swift horses of his army, but rather an intricate web of psychological warfare that would reshape the medieval world. Just as the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote, "Supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting," Genghis Khan would embody this principle throughout his conquests. The great Khan's military genius extended far beyond the battlefield, creating an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe through a masterful manipulation of fear and perception. This transformation, from a minor tribal leader to the architect of history's largest contiguous land empire, began with unifying the Mongol tribes through a combination of military prowess and psychological manipulation, notably demonstrated in his systematic elimination of rival chiefs like Jamukha, his childhood blood brother. The reputation of the Mongol army preceded them like a shadow across the Silk Road. By 1219, when Genghis Khan launched his campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, merchants and travelers had already spread tales of entire cities being erased from existence. In the case of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, the Mongols deliberately allowed refugees to flee north, carrying horrific stories of the city's destruction. The Khan deliberately allowed survivors of conquered cities to flee, carrying with them stories of unprecedented devastation. This strategy proved particularly effective during the siege of Bukhara, where 30,000 defenders were so paralyzed by fear that they surrendered almost immediately. The city's fall was followed by the systematic destruction of its great library and the execution of its scholars, demonstrating that not even centers of learning were safe. A contemporary chronicler, Giovanni, recorded the words of Genghis Khan as he entered the city's grand mosque. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me." The Khan's network of spies and informants, known as the Yam system, was arguably the most sophisticated intelligence network of the medieval world. In 1221, before the attack on Samarkand, Mongol agents circulated rumors that the army numbered in the millions, when in reality it rarely exceeded 100,000 warriors. The network stretched across thousands of miles, with relay stations positioned every 20-30 miles, allowing information and disinformation to travel at an unprecedented speed of 200 miles per day. The system employed not only military scouts, but also merchants, diplomats, and religious figures. One notable spy was Chu Kai, a Khitan advisor who provided crucial intelligence about Chinese cities while posing as an astrologer. The famous Venetian trader Marco Polo would later describe this network in his travels, noting how it employed over 200,000 horses and tens of thousands of personnel. The psychological impact of Mongol symbolism reached new heights of horror. After the conquest of Urgench, Genghis Khan ordered the construction of pyramids using the skulls of 24,000 defeated warriors. Similar displays were erected outside Nishapur and Merv, where estimates suggest that between 700,000 and 1.3 million people were killed. The destruction of Nishapur was particularly brutal, as it was the hometown of Genghis Khan's son-in-law, who had been killed by an arrow during the siege. In response, the Khan's daughter requested that every living thing in the city be killed, including cats and dogs. The Mongols would often leave behind specific markers. 3 arrows planted in the ground signified imminent attack, while a broken arrow represented mercy for those who surrendered without resistance. In some cases, they would send advance parties to paint their horses' bridles red with blood, creating an ominous symbol of impending doom. The Khan's approach to alliances demonstrated a ruthless pragmatism that kept both allies and enemies in constant fear. The fate of the Tangut people serves as a stark example. After serving as loyal allies during the early expansion of the Mongol Empire, they were completely annihilated in 1227 when Genghis Khan suspected they might pose a future threat. The campaign against the Tanguts was so thorough that their written language and culture were almost completely lost to history. The Jurchen Jin dynasty faced a similar fate. Despite initial cooperation, they were systematically destroyed between 1211 and 1234. During this campaign, the Mongols employed psychological warfare by forcing captured Jin soldiers to write letters to their families describing the futility of resistance. An Arab historian recorded a saying that emerged during this period: "Today's friend is tomorrow's victim." Within enemy territories, Genghis Khan masterfully exploited existing tensions. During the campaign against the Jin dynasty, he successfully turned Chinese generals against their rulers by offering them positions of power within his army. One such general, Shi Tianze, defected to the Mongols and provided crucial intelligence that led to the fall of Kaifeng in 1234. The practice of incorporating enemy officers into the Mongol military became so common that by 1230, nearly a third of Mongol military commanders were former enemies. The Khan would often send messages to enemy commanders, offering wealth and positions in exchange for betrayal, creating an atmosphere of distrust that undermined defensive capabilities. A Chinese proverb from this period warns, "The Mongol sword has two edges, one cuts the enemy, the other cuts the friend." The Mongols' tactical deceptions reached their apex in their famous feigned retreat strategy. During the Battle of the Khalkha River, Subutai, one of Genghis Khan's most trusted generals, led Russian forces into a devastating trap by appearing to retreat for 9 days. The pursuing Russian princes, eager for glory, broke their formations and were systematically destroyed. This same tactic was employed successfully at the Battle of Liegnitz, where European knights, unfamiliar with these tactics, were completely outmaneuvered. The effectiveness of this strategy was so renowned that the medieval chronicler Matthew Paris wrote, "They flee in order to conquer, and when they flee, none can escape them." In the spring of 1221, during the siege of Bamyan in present-day Afghanistan, the Mongols demonstrated another layer of their psychological warfare. After the death of Genghis Khan's grandson Mutu Khan, the Khan ordered not just the city's destruction, but commanded that no living thing should survive, not even cats or dogs. The site was renamed Maubali, or City of Sorrow, and remained uninhabited for generations. The destruction was so complete that local legends claim the ground remained poisoned for 100 years. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din recorded that even the stones wept at the desolation. Through these calculated strategies of terror, misinformation, and betrayal, Genghis Khan created an empire that covered 12 million square miles by the time of his death in 1227. His psychological warfare was so effective that cities as far as Vienna trembled at the mere mention of his name, even though his armies never reached that far. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir captured the devastation in his chronicles, writing, "For many years I put off writing about this event. If someone said that since God created Adam until now the world had not been afflicted with such a calamity, he would be right." From boiling cauldrons to molten silver, Genghis Khan's most terrifying punishments. In the shadow of the Mongol Empire's meteoric rise, a system of punishment so severe emerged that it would echo through centuries, leaving an indelible mark on human history. As the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu once wrote, "Those who control others through force will never truly succeed," yet Genghis Khan seemed to defy this wisdom, creating an empire where fear and brutal justice became the cornerstone of governance. The great Khan's approach to discipline and punishment wasn't merely about retribution, it was a calculated instrument of power that helped forge the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, spanning from Korea to Eastern Europe. The Yasa, Genghis Khan's legal code established around 1206 near Lake Baikal, codified a brutal hierarchy of punishment that began within his own ranks. The code contained 36 specific capital offenses, including urinating in running water, which was considered sacred, and cooking food with unwashed hands. According to Persian historian Juvaini, the code mandated death for warriors who abandoned their comrades in battle, with one particularly chilling account from 1214 describing how 3 deserters from the siege of Zhongdu were publicly executed by being broken in half, a punishment that literally split the body at the waist. The famous commander Jebe faced this potential fate after killing Genghis Khan's horse in battle, but was spared after showing exceptional courage in admitting his deed. The message was clear. Loyalty wasn't merely expected, it was enforced through terror. The Khan's treatment of spies and traitors was especially severe. In 1219, during the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, a captured spy was subjected to the death by 1,000 cuts, where pieces of flesh were systematically removed while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. This execution was performed before the entire army, serving as a grim reminder of the consequences of betrayal. In another instance, in 1220, a group of Merkit tribal spies were buried up to their necks in sand and left to die of thirst while honey was poured over their faces, attracting insects. According to contemporary Chinese chronicles, Genghis Khan once proclaimed, "A traitor's death serves 2 purposes. It ends 1 betrayal and prevents 1,000 more." The Muslim historian al-Nasawi recorded that even the bravest warriors would tremble at the mere mention of Mongol justice. Public executions became elaborate spectacles of state power. In 1220, after the fall of Bukhara, the city's wealthy merchants who had initially resisted were gathered in the main square. The Khan ordered them to be executed by pouring molten silver into their eyes and ears, a symbolic punishment for their greed. This practice was later repeated in Samarkand, where gold was used instead of silver for particularly wealthy offenders. The Arabic historian Ibn al-Athir recorded that the screams could be heard across the city and the spectacle lasted for 3 days. In another instance at Balkh in 1221, captured soldiers were used as human shields during the siege, their bodies pierced with arrows from both sides. The Persian poet Sadi Shirazi wrote of these events, "The mercy of the mighty is far better than the justice of the weak." The Khan's method of crushing resistance followed a systematic pattern that became known as the 7 Steps of Destruction. When the city of Merv surrendered to Tolui Khan, Genghis's youngest son, the population of roughly 700,000 was divided into groups. The artisans and craftsmen were separated for deportation to Mongolia, while the remaining population was systematically executed over several weeks. The victims were divided by profession, age, and gender, with soldiers killing up to 100,000 people per day. According to Persian chronicles, only 400 people survived, deliberately spared to tell the tale of the city's destruction. Among these survivors was the mathematician Al-Karaji, who later wrote, "I saw death wear 1,000 faces, each more terrible than the last." Conquered populations lived under the constant threat of brutal reprisal. In 1227, when a small uprising occurred in the recently conquered Jin territory near modern-day Beijing, Genghis Khan ordered the rebels to be executed by being boiled alive in large cauldrons, while their families were forced to watch. The contemporary chronicler Zhao Hong recorded that this punishment became so feared that the mere sight of a large pot would cause people to tremble. In the city of Kaifeng, an entire neighborhood was executed when one family was caught hoarding weapons. The Song dynasty official Zhao Gong noted that the Mongols created peace through the arithmetic of terror. The concept of collective punishment was central to Mongol control, embodied in the principle of 9 exterminations, the killing of 9 generations of a criminal's family. When a single household in a community showed signs of resistance, entire neighborhoods could face annihilation. In 1232, in modern-day Afghanistan's Bamiyan Valley, an entire village of 12,000 people was buried alive in a mass grave after one family was caught harboring fugitives. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din noted that the ground moved for 3 days with the struggles of the buried. Mongol soldiers would pour water on the earth to make it settle faster, creating what became known as the Valley of Screams. Punitive expeditions were particularly terrifying aspects of Mongol rule, known as the Great Terror by Arabic chroniclers. In 1229, when the city of Herat rebelled against Mongol authority, Ögedei Khan, Genghis's successor, sent General Jamukha with 50,000 troops to make an example of the city. The campaign lasted 6 months, during which every building was dismantled, brick by brick, the irrigation systems were destroyed, and the surrounding farmland was salted. The city's great library, containing over 12,000 volumes, was burned, and the ashes were thrown into the Hierarchies River. Chronicles suggest that the population dropped from nearly 1 million to just 40,000 people. The Persian scholar al-Juwayni wrote that they made the learned eat their own words. The Mongols developed sophisticated methods of torture and execution designed to maximize both suffering and psychological impact, detailed in the Book of Punishments compiled under Ögedei Khan. The death by warmth involved wrapping victims in fresh animal hides, which would shrink as they dried, slowly crushing the person inside. This method was notably used against captured Song dynasty officials, including the famous general Pu Songling. Another technique involved tying prisoners between bent saplings, which, when released, would tear the body apart. This was called the Green Death and was often reserved for military commanders who had resisted particularly fiercely. The Chinese scholar Wei Shu observed, "Their creativity in dealing death exceeded their creativity in preserving life." Genghis Khan's system of punishment extended even to the royal family, following the principle that justice knows no blood. When his brother Khazar was suspected of plotting against him in 1208, the Khan had him publicly humiliated and temporarily imprisoned, demonstrating that no one was above his law. In 1210, his own son, Yohi, was subjected to public scrutiny and temporarily stripped of his command after failing to properly execute a military campaign against the Merkits. Even more dramatically, in 1216, Genghis Khan executed his sister Temüjin's entire family when she was accused of harboring spies. The message was clear, as recorded by the secret history of the Mongols: "Even the wind does not enter where I forbid it to go." The Yuan dynasty records note that during family executions, the Khan would quote an old Mongol proverb, "Better to have no family than a disloyal one." The implementation of these punishments was often ceremonial and ritualistic, following a complex protocol known as the Steps of Death. Before major executions, shamans would perform elaborate ceremonies lasting up to 3 days, adding a spiritual dimension to the punishment. The victims were often forced to bow 9 times toward the north, acknowledging the supreme power of the Khan before their execution. This practice was recorded during the punishment of the Tangut rulers, just before Genghis Khan's death, where the entire royal family of Shishir was executed over 7 days according to their rank, from lowest to highest. The chief shaman, Kokachu, would perform ritual dances and chants, believing that the souls of the executed would serve the Khan in the afterlife. The Chinese ambassador Zhao Gong recorded that their deaths were as ordered as their lives had been chaotic. The psychological warfare aspect of these punishments was carefully orchestrated. In 1221, during the siege of Urgench, Genghis Khan ordered the construction of a massive wooden platform where executions would be carried out in full view of the city's defenders. The platform, called the Stage of Judgment, could hold up to 100 victims at once. Prisoners were executed in waves, with each new group forced to clean up the remains of those who died before them. The Arab historian Ibn al-Nafis wrote that the sight drove men mad, and women threw their children from the walls rather than let them fall into Mongol hands. The platform remained standing for decades as a reminder of Mongol justice. The implementation of punishment often involved complex logistics and planning. Special units known as yasakchi were trained specifically in execution techniques and torture methods. These units, numbering around 1,000 men, traveled with the main army and were distinguished by their black leather armor and red face paint. In 1223, during the campaign against the Russian principalities, the yasakchi developed new methods of mass execution, including the use of large wooden platforms that could be collapsed to crush hundreds of victims simultaneously. The Russian Chronicle of Novgorod describes them as demons in human form whose very appearance could stop a man's heart. The effect of these punishments created a unique form of social control that historian John Mann termed peace through terror. Cities would often surrender upon merely hearing of the approach of Mongol forces. In 1231, the Korean kingdom of Goryeo submitted without fighting after receiving detailed accounts of the fate of resistors. The Arab geographer Yaqut al-Hamawi noted that the Mongols ruled through fear what they could never have held through love. This system of terror was so effective that during the invasion of Hungary, entire regions would evacuate upon hearing the simple rumor of Mongol approach. The legacy of these punishments helped create what historians call the Mongol Peace, a period where trade routes were safe and commerce flourished, albeit under the shadow of potential brutal reprisal. A Chinese proverb from the period states, "The Mongol whip brings peace, but peace bought with blood is still peace." The archaeological evidence of these punishments continues to be discovered. In 2019, mass graves were found near Karakoram, containing victims arranged in concentric circles, suggesting ritual execution. Similar sites have been found across Central Asia, with victims showing signs of systematic torture and execution. These findings support contemporary accounts and provide physical evidence of what historian Stephen Pow calls the architecture of atrocity that underpinned Mongol rule. The Siege Masters, Mongol tactics that terrified generations. To overcome your enemies, learn their ways. Attributed to Genghis Khan during the siege of Zhengdu, this philosophy underpinned his revolutionary approach to warfare. In the annals of military history, few commanders have approached warfare with such methodical precision and calculated brutality as Genghis Khan. His campaigns weren't merely about conquest, they were carefully orchestrated symphonies of destruction that combined psychological warfare, technological innovation, and environmental manipulation into a devastating formula for victory. The siege of Zhengdu, modern-day Beijing, exemplified the Khan's sophisticated approach to breaking enemy strongholds. Under the command of General Mukhali, the Mongol army first established a strict blockade, cutting off all supply routes. They positioned 50,000 riders in a circle around the city, creating what became known as the Ring of Death. Then, they proceeded to poison wells with rotting animal carcasses and human corpses, a tactic that would become their trademark. The Jin dynasty defenders, led by Emperor Xuanzong, watched helplessly as their water turned toxic and disease spread through the crowded city. According to Chinese chronicles, when food ran out, the desperate inhabitants resorted to cannibalism, beginning with the criminals in the city's prisons. The siege lasted for 374 days, and when the city finally fell, the Mongols executed 60,000 civilians who had attempted to flee. The Chinese poet Li Zhengming wrote, "The streets ran red with blood, while the towers burned black with smoke. Heaven itself seemed to weep at the sight." The massacre at Urgench demonstrated the evolution of Mongol siege warfare. Here, under the direct supervision of Genghis Khan's son Chagatai, the Mongol engineers diverted the Amu Darya River to flood the city, creating an artificial lake that drowned thousands. They then used their newly developed counterweight trebuchets, designed by the captured Chinese engineer Li Ji, to launch burning naphtha containers over the walls. These machines could hurl 90-kilogram projectiles over 200 meters. The combination of water and fire created an unprecedented level of chaos. The Arab historian al-Nasawi recorded that the sky rained fire while the earth became a lake of blood. Of the city's estimated population of 1.2 million, only about 50,000 artisans were spared, being considered valuable resources for the empire. Among these survivors was the famous mathematician al-Khwarizmi's grandson, who later wrote, "They brought mathematics to murder and precision to pain." The Khan's approach to mass killing was methodically refined over time, evolving into what military historians now call the Mongol protocol of systematic elimination. During the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, his forces developed a systematic approach they called the counting death. At Nishapur, after its fall in April 1221, Commander Tolui ordered the population of 1.7 million to be divided into groups of 10, each overseen by a Mongol officer called a darugachi. 9 would be killed, while 1 was spared to serve as a witness. The selection process itself was a form of psychological torture. Families were deliberately separated, and the survivors were chosen based on their ability to spread terror tales effectively. The Persian historian Juvaini wrote that they counted corpses like merchants count coins. This mathematical precision to slaughter was unprecedented and included specific quotas for different methods of execution. The destruction of cultural centers was carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact, following what Mongol strategists called the 9 principles of cultural annihilation. At Bukhara in March 1220, Genghis Khan rode his horse into the city's Grand Kalyan Mosque, declaring himself God's punishment. The mosque's marble pillars were systematically dismantled and used as feeding troughs for Mongol horses. His troops then used the library's precious manuscripts as kindling and stable bedding for their horses. The renowned physician Al-Razi's medical texts were burned, along with 12,347 other scholarly works, carefully counted by Mongol scribes. The great poet Rudaki's original manuscripts were torn apart page by page before the eyes of scholars who were then executed. Scholars estimate that the destruction of Bukhara's libraries set back Islamic medical science by several centuries. The surviving Islamic scholar Al-Mustansir wrote, "They killed not just men, but memory itself." The Khan's environmental warfare reached its apex during the campaign against the Jin dynasty in what became known as the Great Hunger Campaign. Between 1211 to 1234, Mongol forces under General Subutai systematically destroyed the agricultural infrastructure of northern China using a 3-phase approach. In Phase 1, they burned crops in a 500-mile radius, creating what Chinese chronicles called the Black Belt. Phase 2 involved poisoning over 2,000 wells, using a mixture of corpses and a special concoction developed by Mongol shamans that included wolf's bane and rotting horse blood. Phase 3 focused on livestock elimination. They killed an estimated 2.7 million farm animals in Hebei province alone. Chinese records indicate that in Henan province, 90% of the population died from famine and disease in the aftermath. The Yuan dynasty historian Yao Sui wrote, "Where the Mongol horse has stepped, no grass grows for 100 years." The campaign was so effective that archaeological studies in 2019 found evidence of widespread cannibalism in affected regions, with human bones showing clear signs of butchering and cooking. Technological innovation in siege warfare became a Mongol specialty, managed by a special corps called the 100 Mines, elite engineers recruited from conquered territories. At the siege of Bamyan, Genghis Khan's engineers, led by the captured Chinese siege expert Wang Jiping, developed the Thundering Ram, a modified battering ram that used gunpowder charges to increase its impact. The device combined traditional Mongolian ironworking with Chinese explosive technology, creating what one Arab chronicler called a beast of iron that breathes fire. The ram was mounted on wheeled platforms that required 200 men to operate and could deliver impacts equivalent to 40 tons of force. The device was so effective that it reportedly brought down the city's main gate in less than 3 hours, despite the gate being reinforced with bronze and iron. The sound alone, described as louder than 1,000 drums by the Persian chronicler Rashid al-Din, caused such terror that several other nearby cities, including Balkh and Merv, sent emissaries offering surrender before even seeing the weapon. The development of the fire dragon at the siege of Kaifeng marked another technological breakthrough that combined multiple innovations. Under the direction of the Mongol General Subutai and Chinese engineer Li Ji, they created mobile units that could launch incendiary projectiles while maintaining the army's traditional mobility. These weapons used a sophisticated mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and rendered human fat, created by the Mongol alchemist Kulan. Contemporary accounts describe dragons of flame that flew through the air, turning night into day. The Jin defender Zhao Hong wrote in his diary, Their fire-spitting machines made our strongest walls seem like paper, and our bravest warriors flee like children. The psychological impact was so severe that during the final assault, over 30,000 defenders took their own lives rather than face the dragons. The Khan's forces also pioneered psychological warfare through technology in ways that would not be surpassed until the modern era. During the siege of Volohai, they used specially designed arrows called Genghis, soul-shocking arrows, that created terrifying whistling sounds in flight. These arrows, developed by the Mongol weaponsmith Hierarchies, contained hollow bone chambers that produced different pitches depending on their flight speed. The noise was so disturbing that defenders would often abandon their posts before any actual attack began. Chinese military manuscripts refer to these as ghost-crying arrows, and the Song dynasty general Meng Gong noted that the sound alone could drive men to madness. Archaeological discoveries in 2018 near Volohai uncovered several of these arrows, confirming their sophisticated design. The scale of destruction was often carefully calculated for maximum impact, following what Mongol commanders called the arithmetic of fear. When the city of Merv fell in February 1221, Tolui Khan established a systematic protocol for counting the dead. Mongol officers were ordered to cut off exactly one ear from each corpse to count the dead, with different colored threads used to mark military versus civilian casualties. The total came to 1.3 million ears, carefully sorted and recorded by Mongol administrators. This macabre counting was then reported to other cities as a warning, with ears being sent as proof to reluctant rulers. As the Persian historian Juzjani noted, they made mathematics serve terror. The Khan's personal secretary, Yelu Chukai, recorded that Genghis Khan specifically ordered this method of counting to ensure accurate reports, saying, "Numbers speak louder than rumors." The Khan's armies also developed sophisticated methods for targeting economic infrastructure, employing what modern historians call the strategic paralysis doctrine. During the campaign against the Tangut Empire in 1226, under the command of General Jebe, they specifically destroyed irrigation systems, salt mines, and silk production centers, following a detailed 3-volume manual called The Book of Destruction, compiled by Mongol strategists. This systematic approach began with the identification of key economic nodes. They mapped trade routes, documented production centers, and analyzed economic relationships between cities. In the Xixia capital of Zhongxing, they not only destroyed the physical infrastructure, but also executed all craftsmen who knew the secret of dyeing imperial yellow silk. This strategy ensured that even if populations survived the initial assault, their economy would be crippled for generations. The Chinese official Li Xinchuan wrote that they understood that killing commerce was as effective as killing people. Archaeological evidence from the Tangut sites reveals careful patterns of destruction. Wells were not simply poisoned, but filled with molten bronze to prevent future use. The sophistication of Mongol siege warfare reached new heights during the campaign against the Song dynasty. At the siege of Xiangyang, the Mongols unveiled their most devastating innovation yet, the heaven-shaking thunder bomb. Developed by Muslim engineers in their service, these early grenades contained gunpowder and shrapnel, creating explosions that could breach city walls. The Song defender Lu Qianxia wrote, "When the thunder bombs fell, even the Earth Mothers cried." The Mongols also employed psychological warfare here by catapulting captured children back into the city, often dismembered but alive. The military chronicler Wang Zhe recorded that the screams of the children broke more spirits than the breaking of walls. The environmental impact of Mongol warfare was so severe that it actually altered regional climates. During the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, their systematic destruction of irrigation systems in the Fergana Valley created what environmental historians now call the Mongol Desert Effect. Persian agricultural records from 1223 show that formerly fertile regions experienced unprecedented drought after Mongol armies destroyed the ancient irrigation systems. Recent geological studies of lakebed sediments in Central Asia have confirmed a significant climate shift during this period, marked by increased aridity and soil degradation. The psychological warfare aspects of Mongol campaigns were carefully documented in what survivors called the Book of Fears. In the siege of Baghdad, under Hulagu Khan, they employed a sophisticated system of terrorization that included displaying pyramids of skulls organized by age and gender. The chronicler Ibn al-Tiktaka recorded that they arranged death like architects arrange stones. Before attacking, they would send detailed descriptions of previous massacres to city leaders, often accompanied by tokens, a bag of ears from one city, children's toys soaked in blood from another. The psychological impact was so severe that contemporary accounts describe mass hysteria in cities that had merely heard rumors of Mongol approach. The long-term effectiveness of these terror tactics created what historian David Morgan termed the Pax Mongolica through trauma. By 1260, the mere rumor of Mongol forces could cause entire cities to evacuate. During the invasion of Poland, many towns burned themselves to the ground rather than face Mongol armies. The Hungarian chronicler Rogerius wrote, "The terror of the Mongols ran faster than their horses." This psychological dominance was so complete that in some regions, mothers would quiet crying children with whispers of, "The Mongols are coming," for generations after the actual threats had passed. The legacy of these tactics extended far beyond their immediate impact. The Mongol approach to systematic destruction influenced military thinking for centuries. Timur, Tamerlane, explicitly modeled his campaigns on Mongol methods, and even Napoleon studied Mongol siege techniques. The Ottoman military theorist Nasu al-Matrakchi wrote in 1520, "The Mongols taught the world that fear is the greatest weapon, more potent than any sword." The art of elite annihilation. Genghis Khan's strategy to destroy hierarchies. In the shadow of conquest, Genghis Khan perfected a methodology of power destruction that went far beyond mere military victory. His approach to eliminating ruling classes was as precise as it was brutal, earning him the title the Surgeon of Sovereigns among Arab historians who witnessed his campaigns firsthand. The systematic dismantling of aristocratic hierarchies became a hallmark of Mongol conquest, executed with such thoroughness that many societies never recovered their pre-invasion social structures. The fate of the Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, in 1220, exemplifies Khan's approach to dealing with resistant rulers. After the Shah fled, rather than face the Mongol army, Genghis Khan launched what became known as the Great Hunt, deploying 20,000 of his best troops with the sole mission of tracking down the Shah. The pursuit lasted 9 months, with the Shah finally dying as a refugee on a small island in the Caspian Sea. The Persian historian Juvaini recorded the Khan's words upon hearing of the Shah's death. "I would have made him my doorkeeper, so the world could see how far the mighty can fall." The treatment of the Jin dynasty's elite during the fall of Zhongdu, Beijing, in 1215 demonstrated the methodical nature of aristocratic elimination. Mongol officers carried detailed lists of noble families, with specific instructions for each rank. The Emperor Xuanzong was forced to watch as 2,000 members of the imperial court were executed systematically, starting with the highest-ranking officials. Those of royal blood were suffocated under felt carpets, a noble death that avoided spilling royal blood, while lesser nobles were executed publicly. The humiliation of captured rulers often followed elaborate ritualistic patterns. When the Tangut ruler, Emperor Xianzong, surrendered in 1227, Genghis Khan forced him to perform the 9 submissions, a degrading ceremony where the emperor had to crawl 9 times before the Khan's horse, touching his forehead to the ground each time. The ceremony was performed in front of the assembled Tangut nobility, who were then required to spit on their former emperor. According to the Yuan chronicles, this ritual was specifically designed by Mongol shamans to break not just the body, but the spirit of kingship. The practice of selective survival was elevated to an art form under Mongol rule. After the sack of Bukhara, exactly 7 members of the city's ruling council were spared, 1 for each direction of the compass, +1 to remain in the ruined city. These survivors were given rich clothes and horses, then sent to different regions to spread tales of Mongol conquest. The Arab historian al-Nasawi recorded one such survivor's account. "They made me watch every death, remember every scream, and now I live only to tell their story." The strategic use of forced marriages and hostage-taking became a cornerstone of Mongol control over conquered territories. After the conquest of the Uyghur kingdom in 1209, Genghis Khan instituted what became known as the chain of blood system. 27 noble families were required to send their eldest daughters to become wives of Mongol commanders, while their sons were taken as hostages to serve in the Khan's personal guard. The Uyghur historian Mahmud al-Kashgari recorded that they bound us with chains of marriage stronger than any iron. This system proved so effective that by 1220, over 40% of Mongol military commanders had royal hostages serving as their personal attendants. The treatment of the Jurchen nobility during the conquest of northern China exemplified the sophisticated nature of Mongol hostage politics. Each captured noble family was divided into 3 parts. One group was executed, one taken as hostages to Mongolia, and one left to administer their former territories under strict Mongol supervision. This 3 fates system ensured compliance through both fear and practical necessity. The Chinese official Wei Shu noted that they split families like a butcher splits meat, ensuring each piece served its purpose. The psychological sophistication of these methods became apparent in the treatment of the Georgian nobility in 1221. Rather than immediate execution, captured nobles were forced to participate in what the Mongols called the Game of Kingdoms. Noble families were made to compete against each other in degrading tasks, with the losers being executed and the winners forced to carry out the executions. The Georgian chronicler Basili wrote that they made kings into clowns and princes into puppets. This practice was so effective at destroying noble solidarity that when the Mongols returned in 1236, several Georgian noble houses fought alongside them against their former peers. The fate of the Khitan elite during the 1218 campaign demonstrated the Mongols' understanding of status symbols. Noble prisoners were forced to wear their ceremonial robes backwards while cleaning Mongol horse stables. Their official seals were melted down and recast as horsebits, and their ceremonial weapons were used as cooking spikes. The Khitan historian Li Xinchuan recorded that they did not just kill nobles, they killed nobility itself. Archaeological evidence from this period shows deliberate defacement of noble insignia and careful preservation of humiliating modifications to status symbols. The symbolic degradation of captured elites reached new heights during the campaign against the Song dynasty. Mongol commanders developed what they called the 7 steps of noble death, a carefully choreographed process of stripping away status markers before execution. Song aristocrats were first forced to wear commoners' clothing, then had their hair cut in the Mongol style, followed by ritual face marking with ash. The process continued with the burning of their family records, the destruction of their ancestral tablets, the defacement of their personal seals, and finally, execution by common soldiers rather than officers. The Song chronicler Zhao Gong wrote that each step removed not just dignity, but centuries of carefully cultivated authority. The treatment of the Khwarezmian nobility after 1220 demonstrated the Mongols' understanding of how to manipulate social hierarchies. In what became known as the Great Reversal, they systematically elevated the lowest-ranking servants to positions of authority over their former masters. Former nobles were forced to serve as doorkeepers in their own palaces, now occupied by their former slaves. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir recorded that they did not merely kill the mighty, they forced them to live as the meek. Archaeological evidence from palace sites in Urgench shows graffiti carved by noble prisoners, including one poignant inscription: "I, who once commanded thousands, now bow to he who once cleaned my stables." Religious humiliation took on new dimensions during the campaign against the Buddhist kingdoms of Tibet, Mongol commanders forced high-ranking lamas to perform blessing ceremonies for their horses while wearing their robes backwards and reciting their sacred texts in reverse. The Tibetan chronicler Chopel recorded that 342 senior religious officials were made to carry Mongol supplies in their ceremonial hats. The psychological impact was so profound that some monasteries voluntarily burned their religious texts rather than see them desecrated by Mongol troops. The psychological warfare against the elite reached its apex in the treatment of captured rulers' children. Young nobles were often raised in Mongol camps, taught to despise their own culture, and then sent back as administrators of their homeland. The Armenian chronicler Kyriakos of Ganzak described how one young prince, returning after 10 years of captivity, spoke his mother tongue with a Mongol accent and refused to wear anything but Mongol dress. This practice created a generation of culturally displaced nobles who served as effective tools of Mongol control. Genghis Khan's empire was not just built with swords and arrows, but with terror, ensuring that even the whisper of his name struck dread in the hearts of empires, yet untouched. It was this unparalleled blend of strategy and savagery that carved his place in history, a man who reshaped the world by breaking it apart. As the Persian historian Juvaini chillingly wrote, "They came, they sapped, they burnt, they slew, they plundered, and they departed." Thank you for traveling through time with us today. Until next time, stay curious and remember, history's greatest lessons are often learned from its darkest moments. Goodbye.